I didn't cry when I found out my husband cheated on me 7 times. I smiled because by then I already had the perfect way to end it. The room was glowing with soft golden lights, the kind you only see in those expensive downtown restaurants that charge $200 a plate just for the atmosphere. And everyone kept saying how beautiful everything looked, how lucky we were, how 10 years of marriage was something worth celebrating. And I stood there in a white dress Daniel once told me was his favorite, holding a glass of champagne that I hadn't even tasted yet, watching him laugh across the table like nothing in the world had ever touched him, like he hadn't been living a double life right under my nose. People were clinking glasses, my mother-in-law was talking about how proud she was of us, and my best friend leaned over and whispered, "You made it, 10 years. And I nodded, I even smiled, but inside something had already gone quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm you didn't see coming but somehow survived anyway. 3 days ago I was still planning this night like it meant everything, picking out decorations, confirming reservations, choosing a gift I thought would remind him of who we used to be. The version of us that laughed over cheap takeout and stayed up past midnight talking about dreams that felt so real back then. And I remember standing in our kitchen, measuring out ingredients for the cake I decided to bake myself even though we could afford anything, because I thought maybe something handmade still mattered, maybe it would bring us back to something honest. That was when his phone buzzed on the counter, just once, soft but sharp enough to catch my attention. And I wasn't the kind of woman who checked her husband's phone, I never had been, because trust was supposed to be the one thing we didn't have to question. But something about that moment felt off, like the air had shifted just enough for me to notice, and before I could stop myself I glanced at the screen, just a glance, nothing more, and there it was, a message that didn't belong in my life. "Can't wait to see you again tonight, red heart." And I remember staring at that little red heart like it weighed 100 pounds, like it was pressing down on my chest until breathing felt unfamiliar. I told myself there had to be an explanation, that maybe it was nothing, maybe I was overthinking, because that's what you do when the truth is too big to accept all at once. You shrink it, you reshape it into something harmless, something you can survive, but deep down something inside me already knew this wasn't the beginning of a problem. It was the moment I finally saw it clearly. And standing there now, in front of everyone who thought they knew our story, I realized something even more terrifying than the betrayal itself. I wasn't shocked anymore, I wasn't even angry, I was calm. And that calm didn't come from forgiveness, it came from certainty, because by the time this anniversary dinner had even started, I already knew exactly how it was going to end. 3 days earlier, I was standing alone in our kitchen just before sunset, the soft orange light from outside stretching across the marble counter while I carefully smoothed frosting over the cake I had spent nearly 4 hours making from scratch. Even though it would have been easier to order one from a bakery, but I wanted this anniversary to feel personal, something real, something that still belonged to us and not just the version of us people saw at parties and on social media. The house was quiet in that familiar way it had become over the past year. Not peaceful, just quiet, like something was missing but no one wanted to say it out loud. I remember checking the time on the microwave, 6:12 p.m., and thinking Daniel should have been home by then, because he had promised he would not be late this time, not on this day, not after everything. I wiped my hands on a towel and walked into the living room, glancing at the front door like I expected it to open any second, but it did not. Instead, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the ticking wall clock that suddenly felt louder than usual. That was when his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter behind me, a short vibration that barely lasted a second, but it pulled my attention instantly, like my instincts were already trying to tell me something before my mind could catch up. I walked back slowly, telling myself not to overthink it, that it was probably just work, another late message from a colleague, something normal, something harmless. But when I looked down at the screen, the message was still there, glowing softly like it had been waiting for me to see it, and for a moment I did not even understand what I was reading. The words felt disconnected, like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. "Last night was amazing. I cannot stop thinking about you." There was a small heart at the end again, the same kind I had just seen earlier, and my fingers froze right above the screen, not touching it, not unlocking it, just hovering there while my heartbeat slowly started to change, not faster, not panic, just heavier, like each beat carried more weight than the last. I told myself to put the phone down, to walk away, because once you cross a line like that, you cannot go back to not knowing, but something inside me had already stepped forward. My hand moved before I fully decided, and I opened the message thread. It did not take long. It never does. The conversation was not long, not complicated, but it was clear, painfully clear, Like a story that had been unfolding quietly behind my back while I was busy believing everything was fine. There were messages from different days, different times, some short, some longer, all of them carrying the same tone, the same familiarity, the kind of familiarity that does not happen overnight. I stood there reading in silence, the kitchen light reflecting off the screen, and with every message, pieces of the past started rearranging themselves in my mind, the late nights at work, the sudden business trips, the moments when he seemed distracted even when he was right next to me. It all started making sense in a way I never wanted it to. But what shocked me was not just the messages themselves, it was the realization that this was not new, this was not a mistake, this was something that had been happening again and again, hidden in plain sight while I kept trusting him, while I kept choosing him, while I kept building a life around someone who was already living a different one. And standing there in that quiet kitchen, with the cake still sitting perfectly decorated behind me, I realized something that changed everything. This was not the first time, and deep down, I knew it would not be the last unless I was the one who decided to end it. For a long moment I did not move, I just stood there in the kitchen with his phone still in my hand, staring at the screen as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less painful if I waited long enough. But they did not, they stayed exactly the same, clear and undeniable, and slowly something inside me shifted, not into panic, not into anger, but into focus, the kind of focus that feels cold and steady, like a decision forming before you even say it out loud. I placed the phone back exactly where I found it, careful, precise, like I was handling something fragile, even though what had just broken was anything but delicate. Then I looked around the kitchen, at the cake, at the decorations I had been so proud of just minutes earlier, and I realized none of it mattered the way I thought it did. I was not standing in the same life anymore. I took a slow breath, wiped my hands again even though they were already clean, and instead of confronting him, instead of calling or texting or demanding answers like I probably would have a year ago, I did something he would never expect. I decided to wait. That night, when Daniel finally walked through the door at 8:47 p.m., he smiled like everything was normal, like he had not been somewhere else just hours before, like he had not sent messages that could dismantle 10 years of marriage in seconds, and I watched him carefully, noticing things I had ignored for months, the way he avoided direct eye contact for just a second too long, the way he placed his phone face down on the table without thinking, the way his voice sounded slightly rehearsed. When he apologized for being late, I nodded, I smiled back, I even told him dinner was almost ready, and he looked relieved like he had passed some invisible test without even realizing he was being evaluated. We sat at the table together, eating quietly, talking about small things that suddenly felt meaningless, and every time he spoke, I found myself comparing his words to what I had read earlier, measuring the gap between the man sitting across from me and the one who existed in those messages. Later that night, after he fell asleep, I picked up my phone and did something I had never done before. I started documenting everything. I went back to the messages I had seen, memorizing names, dates, patterns, and over the next 2 days I paid attention to everything, every call, every excuse, every moment he stepped away from me to check his phone. And what I discovered was worse than I imagined, because it was not just one woman, not just one mistake repeated, it was a pattern, a routine, something he had built into his life like it belonged there. I found traces of different conversations, different names saved under harmless labels, different schedules that overlapped with the times he told me he was working late. And with each discovery, the number grew in my mind until I could not ignore it anymore. 7 separate times, 7 separate moments where he chose someone else over the life we built together. And yet somehow he still came home, still sat across from me, still said goodnight like nothing had changed. By the second day, I was no longer searching for confirmation, I already had it. What I was building now was something else entirely, something deliberate, something that required patience, because I was no longer reacting to his betrayal, I was preparing for what came next. And as I stood in front of the mirror on the morning of our anniversary, adjusting the same white dress he once said he loved, I realized something that surprised even me. I was not doing this for revenge, I was doing it for closure, because by the time tonight was over, I was not going to be the woman who got cheated on, I was going to be the woman who chose exactly how her story ended. The morning of our anniversary arrived with a kind of stillness that felt almost unreal, like the world had decided to pause just long enough for me to catch up with everything I had learned over the past 2 days. And as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the soft fabric of my white dress, I studied my reflection more carefully than I had in years, not to check if I looked beautiful, but to see if I recognized the woman staring back at me. My eyes looked the same, my hair fell the same way over my shoulders, but something deeper had shifted, something quieter and stronger, Like a part of me had finally stopped waiting for things to go back to how they used to be. I picked up my phone from the counter and scrolled through the notes I had been keeping, names, times, places, small details that now formed a clear pattern, and for a second my thumb hovered over the screen as if I might delete everything and pretend none of it existed. But I did not, because I knew that pretending was exactly what had kept me here for so long. Downstairs, the house smelled faintly of vanilla from the cake I had finished the night before, and sunlight streamed through the large windows in the living room, casting soft shadows across the floor. The kind of peaceful scene that would have once made me feel safe, but now only reminded me how easy it was to hide the truth behind something that looked perfect from the outside. Daniel was already dressed when I came down, standing near the kitchen island with a cup of coffee in his hand, scrolling through his phone with that same casual focus I had watched so closely the past few days, and when he looked up and saw me, his expression softened into a smile that would have meant everything to me once. "You look amazing," he said, his voice warm, familiar, practiced, and I smiled back just enough to match his tone without giving away anything beneath it. "Thank you," I replied calmly, setting my phone down on the counter like it was just another ordinary morning. We talked about the schedule for the evening, about the reservation downtown, about who was coming and what time we should leave, and every word felt like part of a script we had both memorized without realizing it, except now I was the only one who knew how the story actually ended. As he spoke, I noticed the small things again, the way his phone lit up briefly with a notification he did not open right away, the way he turned it slightly away from me out of habit, and instead of feeling hurt, I felt something else entirely, something steady and controlled, like I was watching a performance instead of living inside it. After breakfast, he stepped outside to take a call, saying it was work, and I followed quietly a few seconds later, not close enough for him to notice, but just enough to hear the shift in his voice, softer, lighter, almost amused, and I did not need to hear the words to understand who he was talking to. I turned away before he could see me, walking back into the house with a calm that surprised even me, because there were no more questions left to answer, no more doubts to confirm. Everything I needed to know was already clear. By the time we left the house that evening, dressed for a celebration that no longer meant what it was supposed to, I had already made every decision that mattered. And as I sat in the passenger seat while he drove us toward the restaurant, the city lights beginning to glow one by one in the distance, I realized something that felt almost like relief. I was not going there to celebrate a marriage, I was going there to end one, and for the first time in a long time, I was completely certain of what I was about to do. The restaurant was already alive when we arrived, the kind of place where every table was filled with laughter, soft music drifting through the air, and waiters moving gracefully between guests carrying plates that looked more like art than food. And as Daniel stepped out of the car and walked around to open my door like he always did on special occasions, I looked up at him for a brief second and wondered how someone could play the role so perfectly while hiding something so completely. But I did not let that thought stay for long, because tonight was not about questioning anymore. It was about watching everything unfold exactly the way I had planned. Inside, the lighting was warm and golden, reflecting off crystal glasses and polished silverware, and I could already see familiar faces turning toward us as we entered, smiles forming, hands lifting in greeting, voices calling out congratulations for 10 years. And I returned every smile with one of my own, calm and measured, like I had practiced it in front of a mirror, because in a way I had. Daniel placed his hand lightly on my back as we walked toward the table reserved in the center of the room, a gesture that once made me feel protected, but now only felt like part of a performance I could finally see through. As we sat down, the conversations around us grew louder, stories from the past were shared, glasses were raised, and someone joked about how rare it was to see a marriage last this long. And I noticed the way Daniel laughed at that, easy and confident, as if he believed it himself. I picked up my glass of champagne, holding it carefully between my fingers, watching the bubbles rise slowly to the surface, and for a moment everything felt almost normal, almost convincing. Like if I allowed myself to sink into it, I could forget everything I had discovered, but I did not, because the truth had already changed the way I saw everything, even the smallest details. Halfway through the evening, I excused myself quietly, telling the table I needed a moment, and no one questioned it, not even Daniel, who was too busy responding to a message he thought I had not noticed. I walked down the hallway toward the restrooms, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor. And as I passed by the private lounge area near the back, something caught my attention, a voice, familiar but out of place, and I slowed my steps just enough to glance inside without making it obvious. There, sitting comfortably at a small table near the window, was a woman I recognized instantly, not because I knew her well, but because I had seen her name more than once over the past 2 days, and the moment our eyes met, there was a flicker of recognition on her face too, brief but unmistakable, like she understood exactly who I was without needing an introduction. She looked away quickly, picking up her glass as if nothing had happened, but the tension in her posture said everything she was trying to hide. I stood there for a second longer than I should have, just enough to confirm what I already suspected, and then I continued walking, my expression unchanged, my pace steady, because this was not a surprise, this was confirmation, and somehow seeing her there did not hurt the way I expected it to. It only made everything clearer. When I returned to the table, Daniel looked up and smiled, asking if everything was okay, and I nodded, sitting back down as if nothing had shifted, even though everything had. The conversations resumed, the laughter continued, and no one noticed the way I placed my phone gently on the table beside me, the screen dark but ready, because the next part of the evening was not going to be about pretending anymore. And as I listened to the voices around me fade slightly into the background, I realized we were getting closer to the moment where everything would change, not just for me, but for everyone in that room. By the time the main course arrived, the energy at the table had shifted into something louder, more relaxed, the kind of atmosphere where people leaned back in their chairs, loosened their voices, and started telling stories that blurred the line between memory and performance, and I watched it all carefully, noticing how easily people believed what they saw in front of them, how quickly they accepted the version of our marriage we had shown them for years without ever questioning what might exist beneath it. Daniel was sitting beside me, one arm resting casually on the back of my chair, occasionally leaning in to whisper something light or playful, and every time he did, I could feel the contrast between his words and everything I knew growing sharper, like two completely different realities overlapping in the same moment. Someone raised a glass again, suggesting a toast to us, to 10 years, to loyalty, to commitment, and the irony of it almost made me laugh, but I held it in, letting a small smile form instead as I lifted my glass with everyone else. As the toast ended and the conversation settled, I reached for my phone slowly, unlocking it with a calm that felt almost detached, and for a second I just stared at the screen, at the files I had organized over the past 2 days, each one carefully labeled, each one containing pieces of a truth that no one at this table was prepared to hear. I was not acting on impulse, I was following through on a decision that had already been made long before we even walked into this room. I placed the phone back down, screen facing up this time, and took a quiet breath, letting the moment stretch just long enough to feel real. Then I looked around the table, meeting the eyes of people who had known me for years, people who thought they understood my life. And I realized that what I was about to do was not just about exposing Daniel, it was about reclaiming something I had lost without realizing it, my own voice. "Can I say something?" I asked, my tone steady but clear enough to cut through the noise around us, and slowly the conversations faded, attention shifting toward me as if this was just another part of the celebration, another expected speech. Daniel turned toward me with a curious smile, completely unaware of what was coming, and for a brief second I studied his face, memorizing the calm confidence in his expression, knowing it would not last much longer. I stood up slowly, picking up my glass not because I needed it, but because it gave my hand something to hold, something to anchor the moment. The room grew quieter, the soft music in the background becoming more noticeable as voices lowered, and I could feel dozens of eyes on me now, waiting, expecting something sentimental, something warm, something that matched the story they believed in. I let the silence linger just a second longer. Then I spoke, my voice steady, controlled, leaving no room for hesitation. 10 years is a long time, I began, and a few people nodded, smiling, already agreeing before I had even finished the thought, and I continued, letting each word land exactly where I wanted it to. It is long enough to build a life, to trust someone completely, and to believe that what you have is real. I paused, not because I was unsure, but because timing mattered, because the next words would change everything, and as I looked directly at Daniel, I saw the first flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, small but undeniable, like something deep inside him had started to recognize that this was not going where he expected. And in that moment I knew I was exactly where I needed to be. The silence that followed my last sentence felt heavier than anything that had come before it, like the entire room was holding its breath without realizing it, And I could see it in their faces, the expectation, the warmth, the belief that this was still a celebration, still a moment meant to honor something strong and lasting. And for a brief second I let them have that illusion, just long enough for the contrast to matter. I lowered my glass slightly, keeping my eyes on Daniel as I continued, my voice steady, calm, almost gentle in a way that made the words land even harder. But sometimes, I said slowly, 10 years is also long enough to realize that what you believed in was not real at all. The shift was immediate, subtle but undeniable, like a ripple moving across the table, smiles fading, brows tightening just slightly as people tried to understand what I meant, and beside me, I felt Daniel's posture change, the relaxed confidence slipping just enough to reveal something underneath it, something uncertain. "Emily," he said quietly, almost like a warning disguised as concern, but I did not look away, not this time. I reached down and picked up my phone, the screen already awake, already prepared, and without rushing, without hesitation, I turned it slightly so the people closest to us could see. "I found these 3 days ago," I continued, my tone unchanged, as if I was explaining something simple, something factual, and one by one the expressions around the table shifted from confusion to disbelief as they recognized what they were looking at: messages, names, timestamps, words that did not belong in a marriage like the one they thought we had. Daniel's face went still, completely still, like he had stopped breathing for a second, and I could feel the tension rise not just between us, but across the entire room as people leaned in slightly, trying to process what was happening without fully reacting yet. "I was going to say nothing," I added, letting that sink in. "I was going to sit here tonight, smile, and let everyone believe the same story we have been telling for years." Paused just long enough to let the weight of that possibility settle over them before continuing. But then I realized something: silence would only protect the person who broke it. A quiet murmur started at the far end of the table, quickly fading as attention snapped back to me, and I could see Daniel finally shifting beside me, his hand moving slightly as if he wanted to take the phone, to stop this, to interrupt, but he did not yet. "It was not one mistake," I said clearly, meeting his eyes again. "It was not even 2, it was 7. The number hung in the air, sharp and precise, and this time the reaction was impossible to hide. A few gasps, a few stunned looks exchanged across the table, and for the first time since I started speaking, Daniel looked away, his gaze dropping for just a fraction of a second before returning to me, but the confidence was gone now, replaced by something else entirely. I did not raise my voice, I did not rush, I simply let the truth unfold exactly the way I had planned, controlled, undeniable. And as I stood there, surrounded by people who were finally seeing the reality I had been living in, I realized that this moment was no longer about what he had done, it was about what I was choosing to do next, and there was no turning back anymore. For a few seconds no one spoke, the kind of silence that feels louder than any argument, and I could see it spreading across the table, in the way people avoided eye contact, in the way hands slowly lowered glasses back onto the table without making a sound, in the way the entire atmosphere shifted from celebration to something fragile and uncertain. Daniel finally moved, his chair scraping softly against the floor as he stood up beside me. His voice low at first, controlled, like he was trying to contain the situation before it slipped any further. "Emily, we should talk about this privately," he said, forcing a calm tone that did not quite match the tension in his face, but I shook my head gently before he could take another step. "We have had enough private conversations," I replied, not raising my voice, not needing to, because every word carried clearly in the stillness around. A few people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to look at me or at him, caught between curiosity and disbelief, and I could feel their attention pressing in from every direction, but instead of overwhelming me, it grounded me, reminding me exactly why I was doing this. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair like he was searching for the right words, the right explanation, something that could undo what had already been said, but there was nothing left to explain that would change the truth. "It is not what it looks like," he began, the sentence sounding almost automatic, like something he had said before in a different context, and I held his gaze for a moment, letting the weight of that statement hang there before answering. "Then tell them what it is," I said calmly, stepping slightly to the side so that he was no longer standing next to me, but in front of everyone, exposed in a way he had never expected. His eyes flickered briefly toward the people around us, then back to me, and for the first time I saw something real in his expression, not confidence, not control, but uncertainty. No one interrupted, no one defended him. And that silence said more than any reaction could have. Across the room, I noticed movement near the private lounge area. And when I glanced over, I saw her again, the woman from earlier, standing now, her posture tense, her attention fixed on our table like she was trying to decide whether to leave or stay invisible. For a second, our eyes met again, and this time there was no confusion, no hesitation, just a quiet understanding of what was happening, and I turned back without acknowledging her further, because she was no longer the focus of this moment. I am not here to argue, I continued, my voice steady, and I am not here to make a scene. A few people exchanged looks at that, as if unsure what this was, if not exactly that, but I kept going because the difference mattered to me even if they did not fully understand it yet. I am here because I spent 10 years believing in something that did not exist, and I am done pretending that it does. Daniel's shoulders lowered slightly, not in relief, but in something closer to resignation, like he could feel the direction this was going and knew he could not stop it anymore. The room remained quiet, waiting, watching, and in that moment, I realized that everything had already shifted, not just for me, but for everyone who had been part of this story without knowing the truth behind it. And now there was only one thing left to say, the one decision that would turn this from a revelation into an ending. The silence stretched just a moment longer, heavy and undeniable, and I could feel every pair of eyes still fixed on me, waiting, not for more explanation, but for the ending they did not yet know was already decided, and I let that silence settle fully before I moved, because this final step was not something I wanted to rush. I reached down calmly and picked up my purse from the back of my chair, the small, simple motion somehow drawing even more attention, and without looking away from Daniel, I opened it and took out a thin folder, one I had placed there earlier that afternoon with a kind of quiet certainty I had never felt before. His eyes followed the movement, confusion deepening into something closer to realization, like he was finally starting to understand that this was not just a confrontation. This was something final. I placed the folder gently on the table in front of him, not pushing it, not forcing it, just setting it there where he could not ignore it, and for a second he did not touch it, like he already knew what it contained before even opening it. I am not here to argue, I repeated softly, my voice steady, controlled, leaving no space for doubt, and I am not here to ask for explanations. A few people shifted again in their seats, the tension almost visible now, but I kept my focus exactly where it needed to be. I am here because I already made my decision. Daniel looked down at the folder, then back at me, his expression no longer guarded, no longer confident, just uncertain in a way I had never seen before, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he reached out and opened it. The papers inside were simple, clear, unmistakable, and as his eyes moved across the first page, I saw the moment it fully registered, the exact second everything changed for him, the same way it had changed for me days ago, except this time he was not the one in control. No one spoke, no one interrupted, and even the soft music in the background seemed to fade into something distant as the reality of the moment settled over the room. I did not look at anyone else, I did not need their reactions because this was never about them, it was about finally choosing myself in a way I had not done before. You said earlier that 10 years is something to celebrate, I added quietly, my gaze steady, and maybe it is, but it is also long enough to know when something is over. He closed the folder slowly, his hands lingering on it for just a second, like he might say something, like he might try to hold on to whatever was left, but the words never came, and in that silence I realized there was nothing left to hear anyway. I picked up my glass one last time, not to drink, but just to hold it for a second, to mark the moment in my own way. Then I set it back down exactly where it had been. Do not worry, I said, my voice softer now but no less certain.